Hi,
Hi,
there.
Ashley. So nice to see you.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good, busy, but yeah, pretty
Yeah,
good.
I love the painting behind you. It's Yumi's.
It's Tenzing Messy. I
Yeah.
really like it. Yeah.
I'm really thankful for Bhuchung Kata to have asked me to interview you on this platform, Aha Moments. And keeping in tradition, we'll keep this conversation, easygoing. And I know this is a very difficult topic.
I, don't think that this book covers everything or has the whole. There is no, single
Mm-hmm.
truth or version of it, right? But I just wanted a book that can at least open the conversation where we can
Mm-hmm.
we can agree to disagree or we can
Mm-hmm.
open to other perspectives, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this is, I don't think people from the 13 have had a chance to um, really tell their side of the story in many ways, right? Dominant
Mm-hmm.
narrative has always already framed them.
You have been working on this for the last decade, right? Like almost a decade, right? And then at one point you were like, okay, now at some point you have to,
You have to just let
start
it
thinking
go.
about this. Yeah, yeah. And how did you like? What prompted you to think that? What prompted you to like? Let's finish this now.
I was told by a lot of people, like, why are you writing a story that um, sort of reveals aspects of ourselves that shouldn't be revealed, right?
Mhm.
And I was thinking to myself, like, we're also like a society like every other society, right? Like,
What changed for them when you came back again and talked to them? What prompted them to speak to you?
why do you want to tell this Nyokta Tsabu story? The tone and the terms that of engagement I thought was really interesting.
You also mentioned that some of the people left after, Kunga Sudam's assassination, and then they left back home in Tibet. And it feels like it's a very difficult thing to cope with, to understand, because it it feels like a defeat after there was this big exodus, this displacement that happened, from.
In listening to all the stories of the people I met and really thinking about their view of their place in exile history, I think the dominant tone and feeling was really of sorrow, right? Like the organization of the 30,
Yeah, interesting.
have much more
Yeah.
political connotations, right?
I know, and it's the 13. Like out of all the numbers, it's
Yeah,
13. Even though there were
yeah.
only 12 settlements.
When I heard it described as anti-government, I thought like, wow, that is so interesting. The people who get to be patriots and the people
Mm-hmm.
who get to be termed traitors, right? It's very interesting to see
Mm-hmm.
what marks them in one particular light. On one hand, you could say like both of them, their trajectories are very similar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
your connection to your mother is very strong, and it's you've been to Tibet, her homeland. How much has that inspired you, or made you talk about all these questions that you're trying to navigate?
yeah, how complex it is, right? That you have, on one hand, this beautiful effort to bring everybody together, which
Mm-hmm.
is, also an aspect of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, of course, there is always the danger um, when it's informed by, a single identifying factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like version of history or aspect of identity.
Context you give in the book with that school incident at the school, and then how Pimple religion came to be, or say like how they were, I guess, like sidelined when Buddhism came in. I think that's an important history that not many people know.
So yeah, I think like history is a turf that
Mm.
in terms of like the new nation in exile becomes
Mm-hmm.
an important narrative, right?
Yeah.
In the larger pursuit of unity, but also in the larger idea of what Tibet is,
Mm-hmm.
constitutes Tibet, who is part of Tibet. All of those questions, I think,
Mm-hmm.
there was so much at stake.
How did you deal with this question of this murder? Hello, Tsering.
I
Hi, Ashley.
this
Hello. This is Dil.
hang on, let me just organize my
Yeah. So nice to see you.
yeah, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good, busy, but yeah, pretty good.
Yeah, I love the painting behind you. It's Yumi's.
It's Tenzing yeah, I
Yeah.
really like
Yeah, that's
yeah.
amazing.
I
Uh,
always across from it and so I can enjoy it when I'm, sitting at the table having a
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yumi's paintings are also things that I want to buy when I go back to India.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think what's so great about it is it captures all of these moments of like ordinary life in exile, and
exactly. Yeah.
like this one is Tibetan. You can see like a remnant of like children's, but so Tibetan children's village, and
Yeah.
have sort of
Yeah.
a classroom kind of
Hmm.
school kind of setting. So yeah.
Yeah, he himself is from TCV, so that's just like,
Ah, okay.
yeah. So
Yeah, yeah,
he I moderated one session when he was launching his works at the other space in Dharamshala. So he's like
yeah,
amazing. Yeah.
yeah,
But
yeah.
anyways, yeah. How have you been?
Pretty good. Yeah, busy,
Yeah. Hmm.
since school started. So once school is in session, I tend to, I think, just be devoted around
Yeah.
classmates. Yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's amazing. My school has also started and it's the last semester. So I
Wow.
am both excited and nervous about everything else. But yeah.
How is the experience been so far?
It's been all right. It has been definitely exciting given the opportunities that I've had. Lots of training around reporting, writing.
Jeje.
Since I'm on the narrative track, it has been pretty distinguished step in my life, and I'm looking forward to everything after it. Also, I just I just want to get it over with now with the degree. I just don't want to
Jeje.
be, not be able to get my thesis in. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time in the middle of, all of this
No worries.
that you
I'm
already
really,
have. So yeah, I appreciate
yeah.
it. Yeah.
No, I have wanted to talk to you for so long. I'm happy that this is happening this way. So maybe we can start. And I'm really thankful for Bhuchung Kata to have asked me to interview you on this platform, Aha Moments. And keeping in tradition, we'll keep this conversation, easygoing. And I know this is a very difficult topic, so maybe we can get, serious in between. But but we'll try to, in the spirit of conversation and discourse, we'll just have, everything open and whenever you want to, stop me if I'm like, talking over and just let me know. And then, yeah, that's just how this will go. Yeah. I was actually thinking about the questions this morning, just preparing for the conversation. And I was like, what are you doing, Chigi? You don't have to be this, formal, and you don't have to have like all the questions lined up like this. I thought this would even be maybe it will be on more honest if we just have a conversation and not have it like just because people are going to read this book and then they're going to make their own opinions, so maybe we can just like
Absolutely.
have it just have a maybe less formalized conversation, as I'm hoping this would be. So Srila, okay, I know this is contradictory to what I just said, but let me just introduce you so that for those uninitiated, like I'm sure people know you, but people who don't know me also, I will just try to have a small introduction for the both of us. So Tsering Wangmo Dhompa is a poet and a writer. She is a highly acclaimed poet who has several poetry books under her name. Her first nonfiction book, A Home in Tibet, which I remember is a memoir, very moving prose about her journey back home in Tibet, which is still occupied, was published by Penguin. And she has also written short stories and essays that I very much enjoy. I was just going through Letter for Love again yesterday. I didn't realize it was published by Caravan magazine in 2010. So
Long
I was,
back, wow, yeah.
yeah, I was looking through that again, and yeah, and she's also a professor of creative writing at Villanova University. And today we are here to talk about her upcoming book, The Politics of Sorrow, which is about the group of 13, famously known as Tsokpa, and their leader, Kunga Sodam, who founded Clementown settlement. So we'll so this is about I think very personal for me as well, because I come from Clementown. My grandparents were in the settlement. I think yeah, in the 1960s. Post that, they were previously in Kata before, and
Oh, okay.
yeah, my grandmother especially, she used to tell me about Hundazudim and how everything had come about. So this is very interesting to me personally as well. But maybe we can start with, why the politics of sorrow? Why the title? Like, why did you choose? Because you mentioned something in the introduction as to, there's an article I think Tibetan Review publishes which has that name. So would you elaborate more on that and why this beautiful title?
Um, yeah, it's not my title since
Mm-hmm.
it was the article in the Tibetan Review.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in listening to all the stories of the people I met and really thinking about their view of their place in exile history, I think the dominant tone and feeling was really of sorrow, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I realized that the of course the article, which was the editor's
Mm-hmm.
sort of article, editor's note in that issue,
Mm-hmm.
was gesturing to a different kind of sorrow, right? The
Mm-hmm.
position of it. But I thought it was a perfect title which captured the whole story, which is a very personal story, but it's also about, love for nation from
Mm-hmm.
all sides, right? So I thought,
Right.
yeah. So I'm grateful to the
Mm-hmm.
Tibetan Review for this title.
Yeah. No, but I think you talk about a lot of how sorrow can be politicized in the ways that we have documented it. I was also thinking about in my understanding of the story of how Clementown, let's say the Shija came to be. I was thinking about how my grandmother never talked about this, right? Like what they went through as a group. And now that I think about it, they've never showed remorse, but they were
Mhm.
like remnants of sorrowful, maybe conversations around it. So I think you captured that in the book really poignantly. And I want to maybe ask you, how did you find the whole process of interviewing these people who are have been discriminated? I think we can say that in the community for a very long time, since occupation from a different displacement. Yeah.
Um, yeah, it was interesting because I thought it would be an easier process.
Mm.
That I knew some of, my own relationship, I should explain to the communities is that I knew people, my mother had very close family,
Mm-hmm.
friends, and, ties back from Tibet in places like Bir, in Clementown, in Kamrao,
Mm-hmm.
and Mainpath,
Yeah.
so I knew a lot of the individuals who lived there.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that because of my mother's connection with all of these individuals and histories, that it would be easier and that they would, be more receptive to my asking questions about that particular period of time.
Mm-hmm.
What I realized was that I think that for so long, they've also lived with this insider-outsider kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing, right? And I realized that they didn't quite trust me to understand their position.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I was quite surprised because I thought like, wow, you know, I think I do, right?
Yeah.
So I had to then go back and read a lot more, and then maybe come back to them, right, with different questions, and just take time, I think,
Right.
to share like stories from other settlements, and of course some of the individual, I knew them much more closely, so they were the ones who were a little bit more forthcoming about their feelings. But
I see.
a lot of them were scared, which to me was really interesting, because now it's a different time and a different situation, and the settlements are, very much integrated, right, within the exile society.
Yeah.
But that trace of fear, that trace of maybe being misrepresented, or is still, I think, very much among the elders. That was
Yeah.
my, I don't know, what your experience was
Yeah.
like, and so it's interesting to hear
I know.
if
Yeah.
I misinterpreted also, sort of the range of emotions or attitudes, right?
No, I think I would be interested to know what, changed their attitude when you came back, maybe like again to them, because I remember I was in my Delhi University doing literature, and I was just a curious person, right? I didn't think that I would pursue journalism as a career, and I was just asking around. I was just interested in Kunga Sudham and his stories. It wasn't like it wasn't anything that prompted that kind of curiosity, but and then I was just asking around, and then there was gentleman who's now passed away, Garontinzi, one of my close friends' father. So I just went to his shop and talked to him, and he would tell me in very strong Amdo accent that I wouldn't understand anything. And I don't even remember if I have those recordings. But then people around me were so interested in what I was doing. I was a little bit taken aback by that interest, because they were like, "Oh, why is she asking about all this?" And in a positive light, as well as in a like a yeah, they were just interested, and I thought that interest was more interesting than what I was getting from that interview, because honestly I wasn't getting any. And there was someone else that I had approached. My father tried to approach them, but then yeah, that didn't come through, and that I thought was also interesting. But then obviously time went by, and I sort of did not pursue that theme. But I'm really happy that you had. I was just interested in knowing what changed their perspective in talking to you, because you have, I think, the last time we spoke, you said you spent a considerable amount of time. I would want you to know to maybe talk a little bit about that, and talk about talk about what changed for them when you came back again, and talk to them, and what prompted them to speak to you.
I think it wasn't, I don't, it's probably not just one thing, right? I think sometimes it's just knowing that someone else has spoken, right? It
Right.
can be something as simple as that. And also when I first started, going to the settlements, I myself didn't know a whole lot. I was just finding out about, I just about like, what was your experience like? Can you tell me about that time? And it's hard to also remember, when someone is asking you to have like concrete memories, right, to present immediately.
Exactly.
So I
Yeah.
realized, so it was much easier when I could point to something specific and ask them instead of a very generalized question, right? And so I think that the more I spoke to people, the more I understood, different elements and different events, and how perhaps different people in different circumstances experienced those events, and also translated those events and interpreted those events, right? So
Yeah.
I think, then it helped me just sort of build on what someone else was saying, and sometimes they'd be really curious, like, oh, what did that guy say in this camp, and how did,
Right.
because they didn't, I think what was also interesting, like you said, a lot of my curiosity was also helped by attitude of Tibetans who would say, why are you, why do you want to tell this Nyokta Tsabu story, right?
Yeah.
Or they would say, oh, kunsuta kanlaure, Nyokta Tsabu re. or like, oh, the tone and the terms that of engagement I thought was really interesting because they never told me anything specific, right? But they had a lot of assumptions and the idea that there was already, a narrative, right? And so I was very curious about then what is that story behind these, assumptions and stereotypes, and some of them could be founded, some of them probably not, right? And so I think, so I would also ask, like, what kind of perception do people have about you, and
Right.
how do you feel, So yeah, I think it was over time just learning to ask questions, I think, probably, yeah.
I think, yeah, that's the most interesting thing that was going through my mind when I was, going through reading the book. I was like, oh, how did she approach these people? Because as you say, there are lots of people who are no more now, and then there are family members that you're interviewing. Khunda Sudam's son, you interview, sorry, a grandson, I want to say, yeah, you interview, and lots of insight that I get into, which I did not get when I was in the Shija, because nobody talks about this, right? Because they've also sort of like made that memories, I guess, fade, is what you use, I think, or maybe this is my projection of your book, but yeah. So I maybe what I wanted to also ask you was, you talk about the Shija, Clementown. I'm sorry that, yeah, I will try to talk about the whole group of 13 eventually, but I just maybe, because the thing that most intrigued me was how you chart the life of Kunda Sudin over the years, that, all the turmoil was happening. And in that, you also talk about the life of Clementown itself, and how there was a lot of work that was put in to make that Shija happen. And in the end, also you talk a little bit about my Shija, and how you envision, everything to be, and how people around you were telling you, what this meant. And I'm also a proud alum of Tibetan Nehru Memorial Foundation. I went there to
Oh, really?
Yeah. This is just like, and I was like, wow, this school is like, even though it was not the best school because, things were happening, but the vision there was, interesting. And I guess my question to you would be, in the search of this community where, which my family found and many others found, you also mentioned that some of the people left after Kunga Sudam's assassination, and then they left back home in Tibet, and it feels like it's a very difficult thing to cope with, to understand, because it feels like a defeat of defeat after there was this big exodus, this displacement that happened, from the Chinese occupation, and then going back home after that kind of, dispossession again happens to these people. Could you talk about that sort of like process of, that the timeline that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, that period, I wasn't able to get a lot of information, mainly because I think the ones who left, many of them are older or have passed on also, when they went back to Tibet. I did speak to one or two people who grew up, over there and remember seeing or hearing about, their people who had come back from exile, right? I think I can't speak too clearly about that because since I haven't really been there or spoken to them, but the idea is that, they had, they were set up quite well, but there was also mixed reception, right, to what they stood for, I think, So I think, I guess it might have been bittersweet for them in both places, right? Clementown, also the return.
Yeah.
Imagine. I did try to speak to, Ngudup, who was Kuntan Sutum's nephew, when he was in Lhasa last year. But he, he didn't really, have, maybe he didn't want to say much. Yeah,
Right.
he just said, that was a long time back. And
Yeah, and do you think like that from other settlements also there were people who were saddened and upset, and then they returned back? Is that unusual for
I
yeah
think
Clementown? Yeah.
I think there were some other folks
Mm-hmm.
back. I'm not sure if they were from any specific settlement.
Mm, I see. Okay.
Um, I do remember that a few other folks went.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see.
But that
Okay.
might have been related to a different
Mm.
right in the larger story, because I think um, the first group who left from Clementown, I think that was much earlier.
Mm-hmm.
People who left later, it might have been a different kind of um, uh, time in the life of
Mm-hmm.
this narrative, which I'm only looking at the period of the founders, right, when they
Mm.
the second generation. I think after that it was different, and which I don't really talk
Mm.
about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but all the more interesting is when you talk about the leaders itself. I didn't know about the 13 leaders. I didn't know all of their names. It's like it made sense because when they're forming this group, they're not talking about themselves as a 13.
Yeah,
The most interesting thing also, like which I told my father and my uncle, was that the 13 was not something that came uh, from them. It was used as an insult by the United Party, the Choekyi Lhamo that you talk about, and their supporters, let's say, and from Dharamsala people mostly who were close to the central power, central authority. They were talking about uh, Sopo Chokso, like as the 13
yeah,
in a
exactly.
form of in a as if it was the other, like yeah, it's interesting when names are formed when from
Yeah,
the other party, and then it's just like, oh, then you just adopt it, right? Like at
yeah.
that point, you can't do anything else. What do you think of that kind of naming things in this story?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? Um, they were, they had formed themselves as per the Dinsopa, right?
Yeah, Tibetan Welfare Association.
And
Yeah.
Welfare Association. And I think that was something that was really interesting to me, that I was under the impression that um, uh, that the organization
Mm,
came first, and then that these settlements came about, right? But
mm,
in talking to them, I realized that each had their own path, and they were all separate. But then, because they felt like they needed each other's support, then they rallied together because they realized, oh, we're all in the same boat, right? I think
mhm.
it was as simple as that, to
Yeah.
say, oh, we seem to be targeted in the same way, or we seem to be viewed
Mhm.
in the same manner. And so then I think they came about.
Mm,
And I think they were very deliberate in how they were thinking of themselves, right, initially.
mhm,
Because I think they were also already named as being anti-government and as
mm,
dissidents. And I think
mhm,
that's why I think they wanted, Karmapa to be their
mm,
overall leader, but also to form themselves along the lines of more of a cultural, social organization, right? And so
mm,
I think, but of course, like the 13, or Sopa Choksum has such a different kind of valence to it, right?
mhm. Yeah. And
Also, like the organization of the 30,
yeah, interesting.
have much more
Interesting. Yeah.
political connotations, right?
I know, and it's the 13. Like out of all the numbers, it's the
Yeah,
13. Even though there were
yeah,
only 12 settlements, the
yeah,
13th was not.
yeah.
Yeah, it didn't come to fruition. But it's interesting how the name stuck, and then we
And how
still
the name
use it.
stuck. Exactly.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think also, like, it's interesting to think about like what kind of value or like tone is given to the name, right? So that what
Yeah.
it's associated with. So
Mm-hmm.
then forever, the 13 immediately is associated with
Mm,
a dissident, or, and
mm-hmm.
most of the descriptions of the 13, they're either
Mm-hmm.
or they're anti-government,
Mm,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
which I think is really interesting, right, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the longevity of these names, like you were saying, right, and the
Mm-hmm.
associations and what sticks and what doesn't, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even when I was in Dharamsala, I worked as a reporter for Payul 3 years, and I wouldn't miss a chance to talk about Clementown and then tell them that I was from there. And then there would be some people who would be intrigued, right? They would be asking me about, all the about Sokotosum, and I wouldn't know much. And then there would be people who would, have a look of judgment, and as if that I'm someone that have come home now, that has
Yeah.
become
Yeah.
more, I guess, familiar with the government or something like that. But yes, and I wanted to talk about, so maybe this is something that's in the book. The two places that I found, your prose very moving was when you were talking about your mother, and how she was at the Tibetan government exile as a parliament member, and you talk about how she also struggled with that kind of dilemma of being in the I want to say power position at the time, and then also negotiating with the kind of problems that were brewing. You were talking about in the introduction, I believe, or was it in the preface? You talk about how your mother, when you were in engagement with one of the people from, CTA, someone said that, oh, she's anti-government or something, and it's just, it's just a little, it's very, sad when you think about it. When you are termed that way, and I'm not saying this, it's just like it's been a phenomenon. you know
Yeah.
we can talk about how Lugur Jam, when he was running for Sikyong post, he was also denigrated that way. There were rampant folks who were also denigrated that way, but it's not even anti-government at that point. It's just about having one sort of thinking, and then not liking the other ways of thinking. Um, yeah, and 13 were also at the forefront of that. And I think the running theme in your book is about how that patriotism is questioned over and over again, given that we are in the state of refugee citizenship, sort of, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, could you elaborate on how you use that theme all throughout your book?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very nationalism is such a big topic, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm especially, not equipped to speak on it in a, I guess, in a deeper way. But I think
Mm-hmm.
in understanding it, and I do, think about what Romila Thapar says about nationalism, that it has, a lot to do with understanding one's society, but also one's identity as a member of that society, right? And to me, I think what's really moving is, this is such a difficult time in the life of Tibetans, right? I
Mm-hmm.
have, Chigdi Tsokpa, Tsoa Chusum, everybody, I think, in many ways, were doing the best they could in terms of
Mm-hmm.
figuring out their place within society and also understanding the future, understanding the government. I think that's something that I also really took away from the project, right?
Mm-hmm.
How complex it is, right? That you have, on one hand, this beautiful effort to bring everybody together, which
Mm-hmm.
is, also an aspect of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, of course, there is always the danger when it's informed by, a single identifying factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like version of history or aspect of identity. So I think,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for me personally, going back to sort of the story that you brought up, I was very surprised, because I always thought, that my mother worked for most of her life in exile for the community, right? And
Mm-hmm.
she was very, very invested in the idea of
Mm-hmm.
I think who we were, but also like who are we now, right? This idea of exile as this space of Tibetans coming together, right? And so when I heard it described as anti-government, I thought like, wow, that is so interesting, right? then I
Yeah.
then I forgot about it because I was like, yeah, I guess I have heard that before, and I just didn't think much about it. But then when I was researching and thinking about the book, I thought, within our community, the people who get to be patriots and the people who get to be termed traitors, right? It's very interesting to see what marks them in one particular light. On one hand, you could say like both of them, their trajectories are very similar, right?
Yeah.
And yet one gets ratified, whether it's by institutions, whether it's by other, community members. They get termed in one way, and the other get
Right.
termed. So I found that also really interesting. I mean, I think, partly the book is really interested in this idea of, we often in Exile, we talk about what we've lost, who we are, who we should return to being again. And I think I was very interested in sort of like, who are we right now? And like, what have we become? What have we had to negotiate to be who we are right now, right? And I think
Yeah.
one of the ways in which I could understand some of it was really looking at this community of people who really all they wanted initially, according to what I heard from many of the elders, was just to be together with the Paijipa, right? It was a very simple
Yeah.
and clear desire for them. Having lost Tibet, their place in Tibet, coming with their community, and the desire was to go back, right? So it was almost like we came together, we'll stay together, and we'll go back to that same place, right? So in some ways, it's also, I think, like a profoundly, to me, a very moving aspiration and idea, right, of loss. And that was
Yeah.
the way of dealing with it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. There's so many. It seems like that those contesting narratives, like it just, yeah, it for me also, like, can you imagine when I was reading the book, the default is always like, oh, maybe they didn't think it that way, maybe it was not intentional, but it just so happens that intentionality never uh, it never comes into the result. It just always is. The circumstances are such that if you're not intentional about everything that you're doing and everything you're saying, then the consequences are such that are sometimes are not irreversible, and that I think is yeah, something that we can think about. But we will talk about narratives and politics. I'm keeping the best for the end. But but as I said, like, very moving was when you talk about your mother and how she was one of the first people who was the only person I want to note who voted for when the Burn community had put in a petition to be considered in the parliament, and she was the only one who had voted affirmative. So, and then you say that her name is this, and that's your mother. How much has her story inspired you to do this book? Because I know I've read A Home in Tibet. The first time we met was when we were discussing A Home in Tibet at Tibetan Youth Hostel in Delhi. We had a small book discussion group and you were so generous to be there. Because I know your connection to your mother is very strong, and it's you've been to Tibet, her homeland. How much has that inspired you, or made you talk about all these questions that you're trying to navigate?
Yeah. I feel like this question has like maybe 2, 3 different components to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, one component maybe is, I would say, understanding my mother's own relationship where she came from, right? So her own nomadic roots, her own association, relationship to place and people. And then I would say the second aspect, I can't speak for my mother, right? Like,
Of course.
but I think maybe her sympathy for also knowing what it feels like to be not entirely herself in place, right? So I don't know, which one are you interested in? I mean, they're both linked, right? But maybe
Both.
my view of them.
Yeah, I mean, however
um,
you wanna, tackle this. Yeah, like I'm so
uh,
interested in both of the aspects, to be honest.
uh,
Mm.
it's not clear in my head also, like since you
Yeah,
just I'm also
yeah,
thinking through. But of
yeah.
course, like I think um my closeness to Tibet, I think, is very much shaped by my mother's sense of displacement and exile.
Mm,
Experience of exile really shaped
mm-hmm,
my experience of Tibet, right? In some
mm-hmm.
strange way, she she was torn from the place, whereas I was brought to the place because of her. So it worked in
Mm,
that connection. And I'm saying that because she was the only person from one of three people from her
mm.
nomadic area. Everyone else was left behind because
Oh.
she came
Mm,
with my father, her husband's people.
mm, mm,
And so I think that I understood, how these sort of nomadic communities are, their
mm,
their kinship, their
mm,
idea of community,
mm,
their sense of space, their understanding of land,
mm,
their deep, deep bond with land, right? And
mm,
sort of, all the like the deities of the land, and
mhm,
it's a really profound kind of relationship that never diminished in exile, I think, right?
mhm.
At least the elders I grew up with, I sensed
Yeah.
that they were always in touch, right?
Mhm,
They were doing their prayers, they were talking about it. So I had a closeness to
mhm,
Dhompa and to Nangchen
mhm.
because of her, even though we didn't have a larger community from that.
Right.
So I think
Mm,
partly, I think I understood the aspirations and the desires of the different communities of Tsawachusum.
mhm,
Because a lot of them were from nomadic communities, and I understood that longing and that desire to be right with whether you call it clan or
mhm.
tribe, right? Sort
Yeah.
of, I understood that, and I understood that it might have been different from, agrarian or other communities from Tibet, right?
Mhm,
And so that was one component that I think I was always interested in, and I was sympathetic,
mhm,
when I would meet my mother's friends from, the different 13 camps. I
mm,
understood that longing and that desire.
mm,
I never thought of it as anti-government. I just thought of it
mhm,
as another settlement, very similar
mhm,
settlement. So that was
mhm,
one aspect of it. But I think I also understood my mother's role within the Tibetan government as also being similar.
mhm,
I remember her saying quite often that, you know, why is it that every time she was a dotu chidirua?
mhm,
So I
mhm,
remember her saying, like, why is it then that whenever we raise a question, it's always as though we're doing it to disrupt,
mhm,
right,
mhm,
the conversation, and not because it's a valid point or
mhm,
that it has meaning, right? And I thought, oh, how interesting,
mhm,
that she would feel that way, even though she is a representative within the government.
mhm. Yeah. And you,
I didn't
you
talk.
post that in the book as well, right? You post
Yeah,
that how, yeah.
it
Mm,
is interesting in the ways that people talk about it, right? And
mhm,
I was not interested in politics, so I didn't pay too much attention. But then I was always with her,
mhm,
so I understood, aspects of it.
mhm,
And then she never, talked about what was going on, really.
mhm,
I overheard it while she was talking to others. That was the only time I heard.
Mm-hmm.
And it was much, much later in the process of doing research that, one of the Kempos told me about my mother. And I was really moved. I
Mm-hmm.
thought, like, wow, I was always proud of her,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
I just felt very moved by it. And I think there's a part of me that feels like because I trust her,
Mm-hmm.
I also trust her feelings
Mm-hmm.
and her reading of the 13,
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that reminds me of this very important part of the book that I almost did not ask about this whole uh, I guess I would say the revolt that the student revolt that happened at Okenden school. Is it the way to pronounce it? Is it Okenden?
okay, and then
Okenden. Yeah, in the settlement of um, was it Belanji? Where
it
was
was
the
at that time it was not. They had,
okay?
initially I think it was in maybe it was close to Missouri, and then later they
Mm.
moved down to Darwar, and
Oh
Darwar
yeah.
is where they had the problem, right? And
Oh right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
that was a really interesting story, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and you mentioned like all the perspectives, and then the kind of what intrigued me was the kind of communication that was happening between the central Tibetan government, and at the time it was mostly His Holiness's Dalai Lama's office, and then going back to the administrators who were so troubled by this problem that we're having. So, for those who don't haven't read the book yet, it was a small Tibetan student revolt, right, against one Kempo teacher, who they said was teaching them something else than what they thought was the truth. Could you give us an idea? I know you tackle all those problems in the book, but could you tell us about how you came to the story? How did you approach it, and what were the kind of questions that you were dealing with when writing this chapter?
Yeah, I mean, I was again pointed to the story by Bumpo Kempo
Mm-hmm.
in just talking about like how did Dolanji come about, and the Bumpo community, because I didn't know much about um, the community myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he asked, "Oh, did you hear about the Okundan
Mm-hmm.
school?" I hadn't. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so then I looked up, Pumirawa, the articles that had come out in that particular moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and those articles were all from the perspective of, the two Tibetan teachers who had been sent there by the Education Council.
Mm-hmm.
This was the very early stages of Tibetan education system.
Mm-hmm.
The school in Missouri had started at that time,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then Darjeeling perhaps, but a lot of the central schools hadn't yet been initiated, and the Oakendan school was meant to be something a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
It was funded by Oakendan Venture in Surrey, in England, and they had imagined that this would be the place where young Tibetan, and these were only boys in this particular school, that these
I
were like
see.
to be sort of maybe the best of the Tibetan
Oh,
kids
really? Oh, that's interesting.
from the Tibetan schools,
Uh-huh. Right.
who they
Mm-hmm.
thought would,
Mm-hmm.
because the schools were just beginning, right? Um, and so I think they had imagined that these kids would then go on to be the kind of translators, right? Much
Mm-hmm.
needed in the government and society. Um, and so one day, these kids packed up and left, right?
Mm-hmm.
And wrote a letter to the government suggesting and saying that the two teachers had taught them wrong history, and that were also um, uh, sort of
Trying to
um,
convert them into
yeah,
Bimbo religion,
were
which was
disloyal, right? Like
yeah.
that notion of like being disloyal and
Mm-hmm.
anti, right? And I found it like when I was reading those letters, I was so shocked because, I mean, and intrigued because I was like, wow, like
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember in school being so vexed about like history, right?
Yeah.
Like, let alone getting all angry that
Mhm.
this is a wrong version of history, you know.
Mhm.
So their
Mhm.
language seemed very specific.
Mhm.
So on one hand, I thought, well, interesting. Let me look deeper into it, and
Mhm.
then I just looked up all the, as much as I could, trace
Right. Mhm.
communications within
Mhm.
the different parties and different perspectives on it,
Mhm.
both by like the administrators of the school, both by the Tibetan government, by the
Mhm.
teachers who are being accused, um, and you know, just like all the aid workers also who are like on the periphery having their own side conversations, right?
Yeah. They're like, what's happening?
Yeah,
It's something. It's
yeah,
like, yeah. But it's
yeah.
interesting when you talk about how they are also perceiving this conflict. I want to say, and they're talking about how, oh, this may be just a religious strife between these two p- parties. Where,
Hyperimpose and the Buddhists, right?
yeah, yeah, and I was like, wow, because
Yeah.
I have met people from who are Pampos, but it's like they, as one of the, I think, character, one of the sources that you interview says in the book, how did they think that that we would convert
Hmm.
these many people? Like, it doesn't make sense because Pampos are anyways like such a
Yeah.
minority. So
Yeah.
that gave me a perspective, like, okay, maybe there's just like lots of misunderstanding happening at that point. And I don't know whether it was like with an agenda, or was it like just something that they could not comprehend. That was my whole question when I was going through this
But
incident.
yeah, but it also made me think about, as a Buddhist, and Tibetan Buddhist in a community that's dominant, right?
Mm,
This our view of Bumpos, stereotypes
mm,
growing up, right? Like,
yeah.
oh, oh, they do everything the opposite,
Mhm.
there were very negative views, uh,
Yeah.
and still persist, right?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and the idea, I was raised within this larger idea that our sort of time of modernity came with Buddhism, right?
Mm,
So
mm, yeah.
everything dark is associated with sort of the time before Buddhism or with
Mm,
right? So I think that's also so interesting to think
mm,
about sort of this moment in time, when even um, having a burn education is seen as a kind of a threat, or I don't know, it's a complex,
mm,
but just looking at the language and the one-sidedness and
mm,
representation of the story made me
mhm,
also curious, right? Like that, why didn't Pamira also interview the teachers, right?
mm,
Why were they already presented as being in the wrong, right?
mm,
um,
yeah.
which to me, I think, because I'm a writer, but I'm also, I would say, like an educator and a scholar.
Mhm,
I'm very interested in what's left out, right, in narrative.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
Very
yeah.
often I tell my students when they're writing stories, like
Mhm,
sometimes what's more interesting is what you're not saying and what's left out.
mm, yeah, exactly. Yeah, reading between the lines.
Yeah, so
Uh,
that to me, that was really, I think, interesting for me.
yeah,
I
I
learned a lot
so,
myself about
mm,
Brune.
you are? Oh,
No, I said I had to learn. I realized how
yeah.
little I know,
Oh, you are. I thought you said you are from, I know, but yeah, you make that clear. Yeah, I think I also don't know much about the context you give in the book of, with that school incident at the school, and then how Pimple religion came to be, or say like how they were, I guess, like sidelined when Buddhism came in. I think that's an important history that not many people know. I think people should learn more about how it seems like, yeah, it seems like our history started with Buddhism, which we all know did not, and then it's just like yeah, it's just like the mainstream thinking that we do. Like, I think we make Buddhism everything, end all and be all. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can understand that, I think that today it would be a different situation, right? Our reading of the
Mm-hmm.
events would be different. But I think in that moment in time, the only
Mm-hmm.
history that probably was available was Sanskrit
Mm,
history, right? And that is also largely Buddhist history,
yeah.
imagine, right? Like Shakapa's book came out much later.
Mm,
So yeah, I think, like history is a turf that
mm,
in terms of like the new uh, nation in exile becomes
mm-hmm.
an important narrative, right? And
Yeah.
in the larger pursuit of unity, but also in the larger idea of what Tibet is,
Mm-hmm.
constitutes Tibet, who is, part of Tibet, all of those questions, I think
Mm-hmm.
there was so much at stake.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? So I think this was part of it, but the other part of it, I think, was also that this was also the time when the government was building up all of these different
Mm,
institutions. And so, the settlements, the schools, and maybe, um, like United Parties, like
mm-hmm.
they didn't want, independent activities, right?
Yeah, yeah. I was interested because I'm sorry that I'm spending a lot of time on this incident because, but you also talk a lot about this in the how Pimpos have essentially looked at been perceived in our community. I was when I first read that story. I know I have already also read a paper by Ugyen Chotup. I think
Yeah, yeah.
so you mentioned him also in the book. I know I knew a little bit about the incident, but when I was reading that in the book, as the background of 13, I was thinking, oh, these are just students. Maybe they thought something was different because students always have been on the right side of history. I would I would think, but it's not that there's no right or wrong here, right? It just seemed like the reading of this incident was a little catered to maybe the central authorities narrative, which I am also like, maybe I did I if I was in that school, maybe I would have done that too. And then but when you give the context of how the teachers were involved, and then I realized, oh, there's a bigger bigger things involved, like there's politics involved. And even though at the time, as you mentioned, that when there was a lot of tension and nation building happening, the idea of the return was, still very fresh in people's mind. Maybe there were some things amiss that must have gone. And yeah, it was very sad to see, to know that the school was, like it just, I guess, closed down after that. And then, that there were resources at hand that, people could not use because of this
Absolutely.
incident. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you consider, the teachers in question were very dedicated, qualified
Mm,
teachers, right?
yeah. Mm,
So yeah,
exactly.
something doesn't quite,
Fit
add.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
But it's
Uh,
also just an example, right, of like this, as I said, like this negotiation of,
mhm.
um, you know, mm, of a government, right?
Mhm.
And maybe this is part of it, right? Of um,
Yeah, yeah. And also when
and
I remember one of, sorry, go ahead. And then,
go ahead, and then I'll say after you. I was just going to say
okay.
something about education. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, education, like narrative, right? Like I remember one of my grand aunts, like it was so grand aunts, my grandmother's sister, who's also in the Shija, she was talking about so they are from Nakchu, Busar, and they were talking about when they were going out doing their nomadic things, going after the sheep, and then they said like um you know, uh, koram, like koram the khalire.
Agree.
Jaggery, yeah, jaggery used to come from, Phe. She
Oh,
said it,
yeah.
in a, very like normal conversation, like Phe ne any, the koram lead is any, and I was like, Phe ne? Like, what do you mean Phe ne? And then, and so, Hasa ne lead any, and I was like, oh, then I understood, like it's not that they're saying that they're not Pibas.
Yeah.
But that association with the central power was with Pe. So this is just like a small example, but yeah, it just seems. And then and now and realize what you're getting at here. Also, like, you're talking about, not, we are not, comes and Amdoas are not like saying that, we want a different state, because that was the conversation that, sparked that kind of protest from the students. They were talking about having a different sort of national, not national identity, having different identities, like outside of, being a Tibetan, which I think is is a formation of, being exiled. Like, we want to assert that identity. I want to assert that identity. It's nothing to be ashamed of. But at the same time, when you show that, you have this distinct regional identity, then it seems like, some, like, the unity of the exile community sort of
Yeah.
disperses, and it seems like the unity is not that strong then, right? Like, if it is so fragile, and when you
Exactly.
assert your identity, then
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, when you think about sort of like what do we mean by unity? We mean a kind of national culture, right? Like hopefully, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if it's a national culture, it has to integrate the cultures of those on the margins, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, like, for me, the example, the response of the students reveals, what they think of as history, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, which I also was taught and I didn't go to a Tibetan school, but
Mm.
in the larger exile
Yeah.
atmosphere, right? That
Mm-hmm.
all Kamamdo Utsang, was
Mm-hmm.
under the Lhasa government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which was not true, right? Like
Mm.
over the long history, there were moments when that might have been true, and there were moments when that was not true, right? And
Mm.
like the idea of unified Tibet, it was not consistent over the long period of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not an historian, but
Mm-hmm.
having read beyond what was taught to
Mm.
me or told to me, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And the when I was growing up, and I would talk to the elders, and they would
Mm-hmm.
say things like, "Oh, we gave our um, uh, we had to give tax, right? And
Mm.
we went to Siling to give to Mabufang, and but then they'd say, don't tell anyone."
Mm. Yeah.
Because like that would mean that, and I
Mm.
thought, oh my God, my relatives were all traitors, that
Yeah.
they were all under
Mm.
Chinese rule, right?
Mm.
I didn't realize at that point that, that there were these kingdoms, and
Mm.
that there were very complex relationships
Mm.
in the Kham provinces, uh,
Mm.
that they were not under Tibetan government at certain points of time. There might have been
Mm.
other times, right? Like
Mm.
with Imperial China and with the Tibetan government, there were many many different
Mm.
relationships. Um,
Mm.
but that was also not. We were not permitted to speak of those histories at that time.
Mm.
And for a long time, I just thought that all the people I came from were on the wrong side.
Mm. Yeah.
And much later, reading those histories, I realized, oh, okay, like, yeah, people have so many different dialects and languages.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
and that's what, you realize these kids are, um, like the idea that someone else has a different language is an affront to their
Mm.
image of Tibet, right? And that's what
Mm.
that's what sort of they're fighting against. That, oh,
Mm.
how can it have its own language? Like that,
Mm.
this teacher is telling us terrible things about our own.
Mm. Mm. Right. And even in that context, like, when we're talking about 13, I think, um, yeah, I feel like, because we are so obsessed, the anxiety of, having a lost nation has made people, like, really, uh, yeah, fixated upon this unity. But it feels like, from the training that I have in journalism right now, our dean, like, we had a class with her. I used to, like, I asked her, like, if, there are discrepancies in our community, right? Like, there are problems, like, there are so many crimes happening that we don't really know, we don't really talk about. And I was telling her, oh, do I, as a member of a community, expose those crimes, um, at the risk of, telling the world that we are the way we are? And she said, who better to, talk about this than you, because then it makes, and because then you would know that, it was not the the actual representation of your community, so that really made me think about all the things that, Tibetan reporters do. For example, they don't talk about the problems there are in the community. And it just makes, so in the larger context of a nation or nation building process, I would think that if we talk about these fissures that we have in our community, these sorts of arguments, conflicts that we have, so long ignored, it would seem more understanding if we try to cope with those questions and, like, tackle those questions head on. Otherwise, who else will talk to us about this? Who cares?
Absolutely. I
Who
think,
cares in the world?
yeah, I think so, right? I think it's, um, yeah, I was told by a lot of people, like, why are you writing a story that sort of reveals aspects of ourselves that, shouldn't be revealed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking to myself, like, we're also like a society like every other society, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why are
Yeah,
Tibetans,
we're not unique.
we're not unique, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have such a great opportunity of being, like, as many scholars have said, it's like we're like a practicing
Mm-hmm.
nation in exile, right? Like, we have this moment in time to really think through and and think about, like, what do we, want in the future? How
Mm-hmm.
do, how are we going to be in the future? Should
Mm-hmm.
we, have our own
Mm-hmm.
nation, right? And I feel like um, there has to be multiple stories and perspectives, right? And we
Mm-hmm.
have to be able to accept um, all of our different stories, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the aspects of, like, I'm going to be reading Arundhati Roy's Ministry of Utmost Happiness
Mm-hmm.
in a class pretty soon.
Aha.
And what I love about it is the fact that, there are so many diverse texts in it, right? You
Mm-hmm.
have just letters, and you have scraps of papers, and you have, like, first of all, there's the multiple layers of and different texts, and then
Mm-hmm.
also so many voices, so many languages, right, within this novel. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's the answer, right? It might seem chaotic, but I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
look what we've ended up with if we're only going to enforce a single kind of identifying factor, right?
Mm-hmm. And I also think, like, if we are to observe these sort of, contradictory things that have, we have said and what we have done, it
Yeah.
also sort of, like, makes our our identities as Tibetans stronger against the, I guess, like, what we know as the biggest problem, like biggest enemy, like for
Yeah.
the Chinese government, right? It sort of makes us, I feel like that, like, maybe I'm wrong, but our identities, because they are so nuanced, they become more stronger as an entity against the other that we are trying to have negotiations with. Because having a history is not a problem. Having a monolithic history is,
Yeah.
then, it
Absolutely.
makes it
Absolutely.
a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the assumption that, sort of, if you tell a story that deviates from
Mm-hmm.
what's considered to be the story, then
Mm-hmm.
then you're, a threat, right? Like,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to sort of thinking that, yeah, that there are like multiple ways of being.
Mm-hmm.
And in our
Yeah.
community, we have many different people, right? With
Mm-hmm.
everyone, with everybody's dreams and aspirations, not everybody feels and thinks exactly the same way, right?
Mm-hmm. And I like how this conversation is going, because most of the Tibetans who sort of deviate, like that has happened to the 13 as well. Like they're termed anti-China. Sorry, they're pro-China, right?
Yeah.
Pro-CCP, and then they've been called Chinese spies. And it's not like just with the 13 that there have been, sort of some deviances, like some disagreements within the community, within the governments, and they have been called that. So it's not like we're not talking about a past that is
Yeah.
gone. It's still very relevant, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think it's such an easy way to, vilify people, right? And
Mm-hmm.
think someone is anti-government,
Mm-hmm.
anti-His Holiness, pro-China.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, and we've gone past 1 hour, by the way.
I
But
know.
but this is
I feel like
possible.
I've been meandering and talking, but not making much sense.
No, you have been. You have been. So I think we should also talk about some of the serious, complicated questions that you raise in the book. As and it is the heart of the book. I think like we cannot not talk about it. The most important part is how you obviously chronicle the life of Kunda Sudim and the life of the 13 groups that he led, the 12 groups that he led. And the question of his assassination and how the Tibetans in Clementown at the time viewed it. So, if I may, I would try to give you an idea of how my father viewed it. He was 9 at the time,
Wow.
and he said. I was just talking about him. He's really excited that this book is coming out. By the way, he's in India. He was telling me that he remembered being in the Shija, and we were in a different home at that point. There were no walls, so it makes sense that he heard the gunshots. He said
Mm.
he heard the gunshots. It was, as you say, like during the day, in the evening, afternoon, some that kind of a timeline. And then he said he heard those shots, and then for a child's mind, he thought it must be firecrackers, right? And then
Oh.
he was like, oh, firecrackers. And then after that, obviously, it was not. Those were gunshots which killed Kundatsurim. And he also in Delhi calls him Agusurim. And my grandmother, on the other hand, imagine like she's talking to me about this like when I'm like also very young, and it's so much time has passed. She was telling me one day that somebody, I don't remember if it was actually the day that he was shot or when he died. Um, she was telling me her neighbor had just come in and shook her up because she was sleeping, and then told her about the death of Kondasurim. And that has, I think that really messed her up because she remembered it like just taking, like the soul was gone, sort of of a very important person that she felt was sort of like her godfather, because they were orphans. Their parents had died because they made such a long journey. And yeah, they don't know why they passed away, but anyways, like, so they were very much shocked. And I say that because in the book you say very poetically how every member of, like, every person you talk to remembered exactly the time when they received the news of Kundasuddin's death. This is to just understand what the impact was of his death in these circles. My grandmother was really, I think, emotionally impacted. My father, even though he was so young, he still talks about him as if he knows him. Yeah.
Yeah.
and uh, and with that kind of thing in mind, I think we have to talk about his assassination. And I like, maybe I don't want to read too much. I have been reading on Kindle, by the way. It's been pretty. If just for
Oh.
the viewers, it's oh yeah. So in the introduction, I want to read a couple of lines. Or maybe do you want to? Like, do you
Oh
want to
no,
read
no, I'd
first?
love to hear your reading it.
Yeah. Okay. So just to circle, like, because the first page was all just like very astounding. On the evening of June 16, 1978, Kundan Sudam, Agut to his friends, was fatally shot in the backyard of his house in Clementown, India. Hours before his death on the hospital bed, Kunga had given a statement to the area's superintendent of police and district magistrate, naming 3 individuals he suspected of hatching and executing a plan to murder him. Wangdun Dorje, Gemi Tundup, also known as Amdo Tundup, and Pakte, also known as Kara Pakte. Wangdun Dorje was the Minister of Home Affairs in the Exile government and the representative at the Bureau of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in New Delhi. Tundup was a senior army officer stationed at Establishment 22, the base of an elite regiment of Tibetan commandos in Chakrata, India, created in the 1962 after the Sino-Indian War. Pakte was a businessman who lived close by in Rajpur. Kunga Sudham had no evidence to support his accusations against the 3 men, but his pointing them out to police indicated that his murder was of the order of a political assassination. Yeah. So I guess, the whole, we cannot ignore the question of who was implicated in this murder, right? Because it was of political motivations. Like there were people who thought that his rising in the political atmosphere at the time was difficult, like was not catering to what the Tibetan government in exile was, trying to do at the point. There's no question. You implicate Gyaltsab Tundup, like whose brother brother to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, also in this, because Tibetans in Clementown also, I have heard that it's not something the people believe that he was behind it, and I think there would be some conversations, very difficult conversations to be had after, and but at the same time that they're all circumstantial sort of evidences that that come around, right? People are thinking that this person was associated with United Party at the time, or they were with the government at the time. So there are a lot of speculation surrounding this.
Yeah.
And how did you deal with this question of this murder?
Well, I mean, I just relied on the documents and people's narratives, right? And I think, like as you said, a lot of people, blamed this particular individual who was named in Tibetan Review as Tenzin, and also went to jail for a few years. People felt that there was somebody behind who paid Tenzin to accomplish this task, and people, of course, named, either United Party, or by virtue of naming United Party, they're also implicating Gyaltsab Tundup, because they were all collapsing the two, right?
Yeah.
As you said, these are all also speculations. No one exactly could say specific, right? But I would come across like tidbits of like information, so and so would say, oh, in Nepal, this person met that person who said this, or someone else who said, oh, my cousin actually was the one who took Tenzin to Nepal, but didn't get like all of these things, which again were stories, So I think, what's also so interesting is the work of rumors and sort of how people understand and interpret events, right? In this around these events. And like the whole, like Chikdi Tsokpa, Tsoka Chusum, so many rumors, right, that make up how we understand their history, their roles. But also, Chikdi Tsokpa has a book, so they write about certain events, right? So I looked at a lot of texts of that period. As far as the events of the murder itself, like there was this document called, Tibetans would call it Pasan Nakpo, the Black Friday. Pamphlet, which was in Tibetan as well as in English.
Oh yes, I forgot to mention it.
Yeah, so I mean, these facts are from that pamphlet, which was produced by the 13 at that time. And so there's a whole like speculation of who wrote that text, right? Because even members of the 13 far-flung in all of these different locations, they were not clearly all writing this document, right? So, there was also this question of who wrote that document, and then a lot of the fallout that came from Khunpan Sutum's murder was around this document. The focus became the document and not the murder of a person in some ways, right? I think,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
it's interesting, right? Because the
And
document is stating all of these again, certain historical realities, right, which contradict maybe the government narrative. Yeah.
yeah, official narrative. Yeah, and the interesting part was like that those infamous glasses of the person who
Yeah,
had
yeah,
taken
exactly.
my uncle, when I was telling him about this, and I sent him pictures, of those paragraphs, and he was like, "I know this is like that's what, because I remember you said that there was a pamphlet sent around after the day of his murder. Probably they also got the same information. Lots of things they said are in the are in this book, and then he was like those glasses were the ones that people how Amdo
Yeah,
Tenzin
I'm the
was
yeah.
yeah, how he was identified because he was living in that settlement for I
He
think.
was not like, yeah,
Oh,
he was not living there, but he had actually come to seek
ah,
Bhuchung's help. So,
yes, yes, yeah, you mentioned that,
he,
yeah.
yeah, so I had spoken to one of the elders who knew, this
Mm,
individual. And so he said that, and it was funny because when he was talking to Tenzin, um, he noticed the glass.
glasses. Mm,
And he said, like, like it was a funny kind of, he said it was
mm,
like a funny shape. And then he was drawing the the
mm,
spectacles for me and said he remembered it because he saw that,
mm,
there later.
yeah.
Because so I mean, all of these stories, right, from people, I think make it interesting. Like in a moment when you think about, like, for me, I think, I feel great tenderness, I think, for this particular generation of
Mm,
Tibetans
mm,
who came from Tibet, my mother's generation, right, who came
mm,
when they were 18, 19 or younger, uh,
mm,
who really lost everything they had. And I think, sort of what they lived through their lifetime, I think is something that, I often think about, like the Palestinian writer Morud
mm,
Barghouti, who writes so stunningly,
mm,
beautifully on this
yeah.
sort of loss. He says something to the effect of, like, in sort of this dispossession, like there's the uncertainty of return and then the certainty of the effects of having lost, right, everything.
Mm,
And I
mm,
often think about that in terms of, this generation
mm,
of, living every day with the effects of displacement
mm,
and every day the uncertainty, right, of it.
mm,
So I think Kundan Sudom's death meant in many ways like a kind of confirmation of the exclusion,
mm,
something that
yeah.
something that they feared for a long time,
Mm,
and that
mm,
they felt like maybe we'll be understood, right?
mm,
Maybe we'll be, sort of understood as we are, right?
mm, yeah. Mm.
That was the
It
sense
was.
from the elders, right? So
Mm,
I think like this experience of the 13, even though they're still very proud and of what they've accomplished, and it's an amazing accomplishment when you think about people just barely 10 years in exile,
mm,
just building their own communities, right? Like
mm,
something that we could also um,
have cherished, yeah.
really cherish and celebrate, um,
Mm,
instead of taking the other perspective, right? And so I think
mm,
it was such a bittersweet experience for them, right? I think for the elders, but I think the assassination of
mm,
Kundan Sutum was very personal for each of them.
mm,
I felt I
mm,
that's my experience talking to them. Right?
mm,
Very often, all of them, whether they knew him directly or not,
mm,
it's like you have the way that people understand events of
mm,
event their own lives, or sort of
mm,
the community's life.
Mm-hmm.
It began and sort of ended, right, with Kontatsuram. They would say, oh, Tsuachusum's story is very brief.
Yeah.
And it ended with his death, right? So
Yeah,
to me,
exactly.
that was really interesting, you know. So
Mm.
so that's why I started, you know, sort of
Mm.
with his death, because it had it was an event that really captured uh,
Mm-hmm.
and meant something to them, right?
Mm. Yeah. And with his death, I know that I know for a fact that after all the projects, and you also touch on this, you know, at least in Clementown, it sort of just had a different shift.
Yeah,
They didn't work out, right? Because they had no one leader to, you know, like look
yeah,
after things, and you know, who was making everybody, you know, accountable for their projects, for the funds and resources they were getting. And it seems like it happened to all of the other
yeah,
also, which is pretty upsetting to think about, because
yeah,
like it seemed like he was the binding factor. That was not
yeah.
that the other leaders did not have sway in their own people, but he was like sort of making those important decisions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think he was really a like a charismatic and dynamic person. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I've spoken to people, people really I think almost all individuals I spoke to had a lot of respect for him.
Mm.
You
Yeah.
know, just in terms of his leadership, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of his experiment, like his capacity to experiment with ideas.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this they would all say, "Oh, he was just like creative and also not never dismiss an idea."
Mm-hmm.
You're like, "Oh, okay, like
Yeah.
you think," you know, which I think was
Mm-hmm.
really nice to hear. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I must have met him as a child, but I don't remember because my mother was the among the first teachers of that school, right?
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. You mentioned that. I think you mentioned that in a home in Tibet also. That's why I remember
Yeah,
um,
I
that
don't
she was
remember.
connected.
I don't remember Clementown because I was 3 and my
Oh,
mother.
yeah.
We went to Dharamsala after that. But
Mm-hmm.
from the ages of 1 to 3,
Mm.
I lived in Clementown, yeah,
Yeah.
and she was teaching there. And
Mm.
our immediate neighbors were a couple. I don't, you know, remember their names, but he was called Akulanchen. And
Mm-hmm.
I still remember how deeply I loved them, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because when my mother went to work, they cared for me, and
Ah.
they were, in my mind, they were an older couple.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have any child, and so I remember like just really loving them a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
they were among the people who went back to Tibet.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
When I went to, you know, as I grew older, I asked my mother, you know, where's Uncle Akulancha and his wife?
Mm-hmm.
And then she said they went back. And then I tried to find out if, you know,
Mm-hmm.
but they were still alive. But
Mm.
yeah, I don't think they are.
Mm. Okay, that's really sad. I'm
So I
sorry.
have, you
Yeah,
know,
you
I have
couldn't
some
connect.
connection with Clementown.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know, because when I read A Home in Tibet, I was like, oh my God, she was in Clementown. Like, you know, this is amazing. So then you know, when you were talking about, you know, your connection, you know, when you went there, and I was like, she's talking about my settlement again, where I grew up, right? Like, spent
Yeah.
most of my lifetime. And yeah, this is like such a moving story. Like, yeah, I
Yeah.
hope you, yeah, I'm sure they're not no longer there, but yeah, I hope you get to reconnect with them in some form.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the same spirit, like the formation of Clementown was also very radical. You know, when you were
Yeah.
talking about those rakor, you know, those lines, we still have them. It's just that people are now buying lands from left
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
right. Because
Yeah.
it's a coveted sort of place where, you know, you can buy and sell land. Yeah, this is just like just off the conversation, but there's so many people from Dharamsala and Ladakh who are buying those lands there. And then I'm like, oh my God, you, like, yeah, okay, I'm not gonna say
Yeah.
you, but it
Yeah.
was such a place that you hated at one point,
Yeah.
and now
Yeah.
you're like, you know, getting wanting to have benefit.
Exactly, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, which I imagine, I mean, like that's like the nice part of it. But then
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why people, at least I think, the reason why I was interested in writing this story is partly because I thought I would hate, to have the 13 only be referenced as
Mm-hmm.
dissidents and anti-government and
Mm-hmm.
pro-China,
Mm-hmm.
which I think like none of those are really accurate in describing
Mm-hmm.
the diversity of people that
Mm-hmm.
comprised 13. Uh,
Yeah.
Also, all of their achievements, all of their experiences,
Mm-hmm.
their contributions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for those people who may not get access to your book immediately, because there would be audience who would be speaking to, like, who would be listening to this, like, from India, Nepal. Just for them, I think it's important to tell them that Khuda Surim had, like, just not made the settlement, but had a theater group, and
Yeah,
was the
yeah.
first, I guess, documentary filmmaker. Like, he had that, and their cultural group had actually gone to Calcutta and
Mhm.
had also performed in front of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, and with all the contradictions, with all the things that people have said about them, it was not like Galutundu was against His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I think in your book also you try to reaffirm that, because lots of the people from that from 13 have told you that it was Consider was not against the policies of what then was the government by the Dalai Lama, because at that time he had not officially rescinded. And
Yeah.
also, yeah, and also that the formation of the settlement was so that so that they could include all people from all
Yeah.
regions, and because their idea was that the people from the same region could stay together, and it was not like rigid like that. They could change also if they wanted. It was just
Actually,
a sense of home.
anyone could have joined them, right? That was
Yeah.
also the thing with most of
Hmm.
these camps, right? But I
Yeah.
think stigma had already been established by then, right?
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, reading about Kunta Sutrum, and a lot of the elders I spoke to also said they just mourned for all the things he could not have accomplished, because they felt like in that brief time in exile, he was able to do so much, right? Like he really, um, to them, he was visionary and also like just so creative. Like the Amdo theater group that he
Mm-hmm.
established, they went to Bombay, Calcutta, they went everywhere. There were
Yeah.
like 100 people going in trains, and
Mm-hmm.
so that
Yeah.
itself is pretty remarkable, right? Like
It
this is
is.
barely few years in exile.
Mm-hmm.
And then the film Roof of the World, which
Mm-hmm.
is a really fantastic film. It's a black and white film, and
Have you watched it?
yeah, but
Oh
I
my
think
God. Yeah.
they didn't take care of it, so it really much of the film was spoiled.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to
Mm-hmm.
reach out to someone
Mm-hmm.
to see if the
Mm-hmm.
Indian what is it, the film archives
Mm-hmm.
had a copy, but they said in
Oh,
the 1970s or 80s there was a fire and maybe it burned or something.
right. Mm-hmm.
But it's a motion. It's a feature film,
All right.
but it's all the characters are from Clementown who are acting in it, right?
Yeah, I thought it was a documentary. Recently, I was told
But
it
it,
was
it
not.
has it's a very documentary feel, right?
Really?
Because it's
Uh-huh.
really saying like this is a Tibetan culture. So
Right.
like
Uh-huh.
I think the shooting is in maybe Spiti area, has
Mm.
that same rugged kind of
Yeah. They made it seem like
but
it
it
was
has
like
like,
coming from
yeah,
Tibet.
it's
Yeah.
featured, but it's it's like it's a
Mm.
mixed kind of
Wow. So avant-garde.
yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
So I think, it's like he really was in some ways, I think a interesting and valuable person, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
just naming him as like pro China or pro
Mm-hmm.
Taiwanese or head of
Mm-hmm.
the Mongolian Tibetan
Mm-hmm.
Commission, that doesn't get like all of those are
Mm-hmm.
also speculative, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was really interested to see how you would tackle that question, because my father, of course, like he told me that they were told that, oh, this is the person who Taiwan Posangye, Taiwan
Yeah,
Posangye, and
exactly.
that
All
conversation
the
is not.
all the 13 camps were just completely like off the bat. They said, "Oh, Teme
Taiwan
Posangye,"
Posangye, yeah, and
and
then
it's not true.
yeah, I actually went to Taiwan as part of a class before, and then I had spoken to some Tibetans there, and there was like, yeah, the complete confusion about what has gone on. There seems like it, as you mentioned two people from the 13 who were like also part of the who was also part of the parliament, but then they were sort of like excluded, which they were also, I think, mentioned in the seven resolution, or was it five resolution? Like they were
Yeah,
publicly sent
yeah,
out, but then it seemed like they were also, from their perspective, they had gone to advocate for the Tibetans in Taiwan, right? Not like this. Let's forget the fact that at the time the government also had like
yeah, exactly.
Operation
But I
Boyfriend.
mean, also the
Yeah,
interesting thing is Kundan Sutum was among the first member of parliaments,
yeah,
representing AMDO, right? So
yeah.
all of them were, involved, were part of the government, right? But was
Mm-hmm.
seen as, and I think that's the interesting part, right? Within
Mm-hmm.
our politics, in the present moment, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
The regional and the sort of religious representation. There's always like this friction of, somehow like the Dotu is always seen as
mhm.
um, like a,
Yeah,
I, yeah, yeah.
yeah. Always
I don't
the
want to go
yeah.
there.
Oh.
I don't understand
No, and then okay, let's since we're
that.
having this like conversation like tangentially, it's funny when there's football matches in the Ramsala where there are Clementown people from Clementown and Beer, and then they're always like, oh, we know what's gonna happen, and then they're always like expecting a fight, which
Yeah,
sometimes
yeah,
Tibetan like from our Shija, like guys are like now much more like like they're like us, they're like us, they're kids, right? Like they
yeah,
won't have a fight like, until unless like there's this some tension in the game itself. But yeah, that kind of yeah, let alone compass, it's just like now
yeah, yeah,
put on these settlement identities, which is like more interesting, I think, these days.
yeah,
um but
yeah.
having said that, I mean, the Mongolian Tibetan Association Commission, I think there were some sort of like connection, but not through like directly 13.
Yeah.
Some person that I was talking to said that it was simply a power politics, power game that was being played between Gyalo Thandup and Kundatsurim. They had some sort of connection. That's, I think, there was reason to speculate, oh, what's happening there. But you also talk about these two individuals that I had never heard about before, who were also denigrated in the same way that Kundatsurim was later on, and by that association, all of Clementown
Yeah,
folks and all of I think other people from the
all of them.
13 as well. And Tevin Paul saying that, I first of all, I never understood what it meant, and then afterwards I
Yeah,
was like, oh my god, that's like so
yeah,
bad.
yeah,
And because KMT at the time, like if they had any connection with the Tibetans, they also had an agenda on their own to do something on their do something, or maybe they were duped, right? Like if maybe they were maybe they knew what they were doing, like if they had any connection, I'm saying, because there's no way to find
yeah,
out because everything is shut down. Maybe this conversation will have that difficult will lead to different conversations that is talking about this. You sort of like maybe I think in the book you do tackle that, but at the same time there's no like you tackle all the things that were said at the time. And I felt like, okay, uh yeah, that other thing was in my head, like, okay, at the time there were government representatives who were also trying to get something out of Taiwan, right?
yeah,
And now it's become an ally for us, right? Now it's like, okay, let's talk about
yeah.
Taiwanese
I mean,
collaboration. It's just,
exactly.
yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's why I also say, like, how is it that, the stigma and the ways in which the 13 are marked, right,
Mm-hmm.
continue. When in the 1960s and 70s, it was a very particular time where
Mm-hmm.
it was for a few things, right? One,
Mm-hmm.
that they had attempted to seek Indian citizenship.
Yeah.
Two, that they were alleged to have
Mm.
relations with,
Mm.
TSE.
Yeah.
Those were the accusations against them, right? And
Mm.
they sort of, were seen as
Mm-hmm.
maybe finding a place for themselves within the religious communities, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And actually, as I mentioned, like not long after, the Tibetan government themselves were seen to have relations with Taiwan, and then
Mm-hmm.
citizenship also. That's not
Oh
a
yeah.
big deal, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think those are important also to put in context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
Yeah.
yet, and yet people still talk about, Thewen Posangye and uh,
Mm-hmm.
disgrace to the community and things like that.
Mm.
You know,
Mm.
you really press on them for exact, evidence or proof. There's really not much they
Mm-hmm.
can offer
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
than other than stereotypes. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, at that time, there were possibly individuals among the 13 communities who had relations with MTSC.
Mm.
There were people in the larger community who had also.
Yeah. Mm.
It
Exactly. And then the
wasn't something that only,
Mm.
um, people in
Mm.
the 13, and maybe a few individuals, like Kuntatsurum had
Mm.
said. Or
Mm.
organization didn't have ties, but he said, I don't know about individuals, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the blanketed sort of defamation that happened, like it's
Uh,
yeah, very uncalled for. Like just like
uh,
my family who like lived in like very disadvantaged circumstances, we didn't have, we didn't get anything from Taiwan. So if
yeah,
if that were true, then maybe like
right,
I
right.
wouldn't say the things that I'm saying right now. But
Yeah,
if
exactly.
because these things are not true, it seems wrongly placed.
And also, I mean,
Mm.
these sort of these kind of accusations within our community have real effect,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I
Yeah.
think that's what I think, I also feel is important to clarify, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they did shape the lives, and they did make it very difficult for
Mm-hmm.
many people, and they did make it hard for people to feel like they
Mm-hmm.
belonged, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's that at the root of this whole story is really just a desire to belong, right, to
Mm-hmm.
the large exile community after having been displaced from Tibet, right? So,
Mm-hmm. And in the larger scheme of things, also like we have to emphasize that it was they made it out as if like they I'm saying the popular narrative said that we only got funding from Taiwan. If that was so, like it was not true because you say there was a lot of funding from the Swiss agencies. We had those were sanctioned by the exile government at the time. They knew about it. So and then when you're talking about all these communication that happened, that just debunks this sort of the dominance of Taiwanese funds that were flowing. I don't know where they went, but they were flowing into the settlements, which was not true. There were diversification of
wonderful.
funding.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I didn't find any evidence of any of
Mm,
them receiving funds from Taiwan.
I don't think so. Yeah, because they don't.
They got funding from was from, sort of
Mm,
all of the international
mm-hmm,
organizations who were working with CTA
mm-hmm.
at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah. Oh, really? That would be interesting to
Yeah,
to know more about. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, but
So
do you think is it too far fetched to argue that because they were already sort of like thought of as a very successful group, and then the United Party, the Chidu Sohwa saw an opportunity to I don't know use that to their advantage and say like these people are alliance had allegiance to Kuomintang. I don't know like how I don't know how it played out at that time because the information was so you know not transparent that people did not have their time to speak. I think it was just like one narrative, just like being blasted into the communities.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think by positioning the 13 as the enemy of the community, they shaped their own selves as the true patriots, right? I think that
Mm,
of this othering of
yeah.
13 was a way that they differentiated themselves as
Mm,
um, people who could offer unity, could bring unity, and were
mm,
on like the right side of history, as it were, right? And a lot
mm,
of Tibetan biographies and autobiographies, when you read them, it's really about that, right? Like that
mm,
I was on the right side and did
mhm.
and
Yeah.
like so the implication being that the others were not, right? And I think
Mhm,
I see it, a little bit that way, right? That
mhm,
United Party folks. Um, in framing the 13 as the wrong kind of Tibetan,
mm,
positioning
yeah.
themselves as, um, on the right side. Yeah.
Mhm. So yeah, and at the heart of it, like I already we talked about this, but it's a narrative. It's the book about who gets to tell the story, at least of the contemporary history, and how nation, like, in the attempt to build a nation and a nation state, a national identity, we want to form these, I guess, united sort of like a community, so that we can have a, I guess, and it was all in the garb of democracy,
Yeah.
and it
And
is still, and
yeah,
unity, yeah, and you make that you make that argument also in the book, um, and so it then it all comes down to who adheres to the power of the center, right? Like, and people on the margins always having to make sense of the fact that they have to say, I believe in the authority of His Holiness.
yeah,
But here, I think like bigger things are at play, with United Party, who was behind it. Questions about whether it was all about politics. At the end of the day, like why are we even like so sensitive about who was behind it? Because so many people have been wronged, and I don't think they care anymore. I don't
yeah,
think now it's like, okay, however you want to take it. We don't care, and that is indifferent, like, which I think is so sad. Like, indifference is, I think, even sadder than being upset about things. Indifference is just like, now
yeah,
what can you do? Like, you can't jail
yeah.
us anymore.
That's
It's
yeah,
sad.
yeah. That is true. I think I think from talking to many of the 13 members, and particularly you know two of the elders I really cared for who have passed away since. One passed
Mm-hmm.
away last year.
Mm-hmm.
His name was Sodam, and he was
Mm-hmm.
really, um, such a sort of wonderful, generous person who would read the text with me. My it's not very strong, I'd read it and I'd be like, I don't understand what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would
Yeah.
read it together and he'd, explain. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
he passed away, and then Yuja from Mainpat, who was also another
Mm-hmm.
I was really, fond of. I'd known as a child.
Mm-hmm.
It really moved me to see at the heart of all their struggles, sort
Mm-hmm.
of that bittersweet feeling, right, that they
Mm-hmm.
carried.
Mm-hmm.
And, from Yuja and from Sodam, I understood how for them it was always about how to be part of the larger community, right? And not
Mm-hmm.
at all about breaking away, which is
Mm-hmm.
the ways in which people generally understand the 13, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
so yeah, I learned a lot from the elders from
Mm-hmm.
the community. Yeah. Um, yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
forgot I was going to say something, but I forgot.
No, that's okay. Yeah, if it comes to you, just stop me. Yeah,
Yeah.
so this is perfectly, I think, aligned with what even For me, even though I'm a very privileged, I think I have a loving family. I'm privileged in the sense that I'm here at Berkeley, doing my master's through the Tibetan government in exile, and having that kind of understanding of coming from I guess where things are acceptable, like in Dharamsala, like now that I'm there, there are more people who will listen to me, and I've been in centers of powers, that be, at the moment, and I feel like even there, I always had to tell them that my mother is from Hobra Uzang, and my father is from Nakchu. So because there were a lot of tensions during the parliamentary strife that had
Yeah.
happened also. And I had made it a point just to tell them, oh, my mother is from Uzang, Appa is from,
Yeah.
even though I had spent more time with my paternal grandparents, who I spoke about today. Um, there are still remnants of that. And, and governments are very, yeah, they're very difficult to understand. It's always their nature to be not transparent. That's why I think so many problems. It's difficult. So it was difficult during my Dharamsala as a reporter also to ask questions to authorities. It is
Yeah.
still not that transparent, even though I think like, the administration is trying to be more transparent. But I understand, given the exile conditions, there are struggles and problems. Um, but yeah, I just like, as a commentary, yeah, of how Dharamsala can be a little stifling if you want to have a dissenting voice in that
Yeah.
sense. Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, not so much in, I guess, people who are in the West, or say like in Europe, or in America or in Canada, they have the power to say now, and it also feels like
Yeah.
in Gyaga, people in there, like the people who are still there in the 13 settlements, they still don't want to talk about it. At least
Yeah.
here in the West, like there are people who
Yeah.
are like vocal about it and can't talk about it. But our audience is just like white
Yeah.
people at this point,
Yeah.
and then like who are we
Yeah.
speaking to anymore? So that becomes, I think, difficult.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, this is like I don't think that this book um covers everything or
Mm-hmm.
has the whole, there is no, single truth or version of it, right? But I just wanted a book that can at least open the conversation where we can
Mm-hmm.
we can agree to disagree, or we can
Mm-hmm.
open to other perspectives, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this is, I don't think people from the 13 have had a chance to um, really tell their side of the story in many ways, right? Dominant
Mm-hmm.
narrative has always already framed them, you know,
Yeah.
in all the footbooks or footnotes of books and references, they've already been seen in a particular way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I just wanted it to be just the opening of a conversation, right? And
No, this is, yeah, great. Like I think the scholarship that you've showed in this is also very commendable. You have taken a lot from the documents that I guess sources that come to you, used in this, the 7 resolutions, the 5 statements, and by the United Party at the time, really was difficult, I think, for a lot of people. And at the same time, there were communications from the 13, which were almost always ignored, which I
yeah,
think,
it's
after
interesting.
Kunda Sudham's death, also, I think like you make it point to say that they all came to Dharamsala to talk, to have that conversation, and people did, right? And the resolution was never, like, the resolution for saying that they were not at fault, they didn't have any ties with Taiwan, or say they weren't anti-government. That never came out, which is, I think, is a point to note.
Yeah. Yeah, the government itself had said, like, no, we
Mm.
trust you.
Yeah.
They say that to them, but then never make it explicit. And,
Mm.
you know, that's something that, they also felt
Mm.
that the government was not sincere in really wanting to clarify, and
Mhm.
they wanted to sort of just let them remain to be the scapegoat kind.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It was easier, I think, for them to do
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Mm.
So I think and I wanted sort of also to have people think a little bit about the ways in which, in the current
Mhm.
the way we talk about kampas, right? And
Mhm.
I think that people might not realize how, we have also in exile created our own kind of, uh, sort of minorities, or,
Mhm.
stereotypes,
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, many people have, when I was growing up, and because I didn't go to Tibetan schools, I also
Mhm.
can't speak to, certain experiences
Mhm.
that other Tibetans have. And I didn't live in settlements also, right?
Mhm.
I was in Dharamsala and then I was in Kathmandu. Um,
Mhm.
so I was outside of like a settlement kind of
Mhm.
structure, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And but when I was in Delhi and I was part of the Tibetan Youth Congress, very loosely,
Mhm.
at meetings, they never thought I was, somehow they thought I was something else, right? Like,
Mhm.
because in their minds, maybe they had an idea of what a kampa is. So I
Right.
was very surprised because I had grown up in Kathmandu with mostly kampas, right? So I never
Mhm.
thought of myself
Yeah.
in a particular
Same.
way.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
was Tibetan, I was kampa. Like, there's no conflict between the two, right?
Mhm.
And then when I was in Delhi, one of the meetings, people were talking about like, oh, kampa dunzo dinde dinde re, and this and that. And these are
Mhm.
college kids from the
All right.
RTYC, right? And
Mhm.
so then I said, oh, nga kamba yi, Then
Mhm.
immediately they were like, oh, kira lang me, right?
Oh yeah. External, yeah,
Yeah.
inclusion. Mhm.
But that happened a few times to me, and so I realized, oh, that's so interesting,
Mhm.
um, how they have a very specific view
Mhm.
of a kampa, which
Mhm.
I was not so aware of. Yeah,
Yeah, that we're always so rugged and
yeah, yeah,
brazen and
yeah.
yeah,
And they would
that
say,
we
oh, like I didn't fit I didn't fit this profile.
yeah, yeah, and I think they meant it as a compliment, right? Like it
Yeah,
was
yeah,
coming
yeah.
from their side.
Yeah, they meant it
Yeah.
as a compliment, just in the same way that when I was in
Mm,
LSR,
mm,
my Indian friends in the hostel
mm,
would sometimes say, "Oh, you're not like the other Chinkies,"
yeah, yeah,
There was like
exactly.
all these layers of, difference that I was like, like, is that a
Exactly.
compliment?
Yeah. How
You
is
know?
your English so good, you know?
Yeah, and then you
Yeah,
come
these
here
kind of
and it's
questions.
another layer, right?
I know.
So
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, all of these different ways, every place we go to,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
something.
Yeah. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for spending like almost, I think, 2 hours. Like we are almost at time. But I think the last question or like the last thing that I wanted to touch on is how you're thinking about this book coming out, right? Like, and how do you think the reception would be? Because it is a sensitive topic. There are going to be strong emotions from maybe also the 13, like
Yeah,
maybe they would be like, oh, this was like this is not what we thought it would be, and
yeah,
or from people who feel strongly towards the Tibetan government in exile, who would say like, as you said, why are you writing this book? Like what's
yeah,
the end game here? So how are you thinking through these kind of questions? And but yeah, are you like, I'm sure you're like now you've decided to like publish this book. I guess that's how authors must feel, right? Like thinking about how the reception
yeah,
would be. What are your current like some thoughts that you have?
yeah. Yeah, thank you for asking that question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, um, I do have a lot of faith and trust and love
Mm-hmm.
for my community. And I just figure, well, like, as in everything, there will be
Mm-hmm.
people who get upset, and maybe there will be people who understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I wrote the book. I have to just accept that, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is not the beginning of this is not the first time, and it started the minute I began asking questions, right? So
Yeah.
I've also lived with conflicting responses from the beginning, both from the 13 members as well as others, right? And I've told folks from the 13 also, when they sometimes said, well, you're not going to, write blah, 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 right? And I'd be like, I'm not, this is not for you, right? This is not like I'm not writing for one individual person, right? It
Yeah.
has, it has to be something that, I don't know.
Yeah, it is
Best I
important.
could do, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I remember in our last conversation that we had when I was in Zurich, you said that you had to like make a decision, like I have to stop now because you have been working on this for the last
Yeah.
decade, right? Like almost a decade, right? And then at one point you were like, okay, now at some point you have to,
You have to just let
start
it
thinking
go.
about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how did you like what prompted you to think that? What prompted you to like, let's finish this now?
Well, because I feel like one person can't write
Mm,
know, the full story. Like there are many of us who can write different aspects of,
yeah.
and I'm just one person.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way um, I can do the job. I just thought I'll just do the best I can, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not to please any person.
Mm-hmm.
It's to tell the story that I heard,
Mm.
from
Yeah.
people,
Mm-hmm.
as closely as I could listen.
Mm. Yeah.
Like, I'm not gaining anything from this. So,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
but I
Mm-hmm.
want to be proud of the work. And so
Mm-hmm.
and I thought of my mother also.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
wanted it to be something that she would be proud of.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
So,
I,
yeah.
I think I agree. Like I think you've done a good job.
Thank
Yeah, and
you.
then it's about sorrow, it's about politics, it's about a brief history that, we have sort of, you know,
Yeah.
um eluded, not talked about, ignored, you could say, that is coming to surface after a long time. And I think the kind of happiness I saw in my family when they knew that this book was coming out is also the reason. I think this book is one of
Yeah.
why it becomes important.
Yeah.
Um, Never late. It's good that it's never late. Oh, what is that phrase? It's better late than
Then
never,
never.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
By yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think recognition is so important, right? And I think like stories, like as
Mm,
artists, I think stories are one way. Like I can't fix the situation, and I'm not trying to fix the situation, but
mhm,
I'm just presenting stories, and these are stories about how people feel in the community and who
mhm,
want to belong, right? And I think that
mhm,
um, if readers read from that intention, I think
mhm,
will hopefully bring us at least closer, right? In some ways.
mhm. Yeah, and I think that you invite in the introduction, you invite other possible, threads that people can,
Yeah.
link these stories to, and then I think that's very important because, as you say, this is an ongoing conversation, and this will like, probably never stop, right? This conversation will
Yeah.
have
Absolutely.
different contesting narratives, and if people are able to understand that two things can be, talked about at the same time, and I think
Yeah.
that's a
Exactly.
important acknowledgement. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Edward Said says, like, to read contrapuntally, right? Yeah.
Mm,
On the other
mm,
hand, there will be people who will be like, yeah, of course. What do you expect? Her mother was
mm.
anti-government.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah. I think we need to address that. Like, I think even that kind of commentaries are like I think it just does not strengthen the conversations around this type of
yeah,
conflict. It just sort of stops it, which I think is very counterproductive to I guess what we're trying to do, like democratic process.
yeah,
I think it's okay. Like even if okay, let's say you were wrong about everything, right? Like, but then you get to see what other people are feeling. Why are they feeling
yeah,
neglected, right? Like, what is it that prompted them to say like whatever the government does is not in their favor.
yeah,
I think those are good conversations. Even like one person, if they're not happy with the government, why are they not happy with the government, right?
Exactly.
I think it's
Exactly.
important to understand that.
Exactly. I think, I think without dissent or without diverse ideas, we're going to stagnate, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in all of these conversations that I've had before, like about anything else, like about dissent in our community, I feel like I'm trying to end this on a positive note, like like, because I feel like the younger generation, at least people
Yeah.
from even people who are from Tibet, like I have
Yeah.
good friends, in Dharamsala who are very sensitive, very educated, like very articulate about the things that they say. And I was having a conversation like years back at JNU. Uh, we were talking about the same exact thing. And he was touting all the things that Dashtundu, if you're watching this, he was telling me, oh, you guys are the ones who, had, taken resources from the Taiwanese at the moment, like that time, MTAC. And I said, no, that's completely false. And that conversation just went on, right? Like for
Yeah.
hours. And then after I remember when I was in Dharamsala, he's working in Dharamsala too. And then he was like, Choekyi, remember that conversation that we had? And we've become good friends since, right? And
Yeah.
he was like, that really changed the perspective of
Yeah.
how he looks at the whole nation building, like sort of the refugee community building that we have done. So I think it was just like moving to hear that, and I think it's important. Important to, yeah, let's say like maybe he is right, so it's important for him to start the conversation as well, right? If
Yeah.
that sort of
Exactly.
understanding is not like stopped from the beginning, then we will never progress, right? Like we're
Yeah.
still talking about this. So,
Exactly.
and it's
Yeah.
never come out in this form, right? Like this is the first official sort of like a academic paper. Like maybe there have been in Tibetan,
Yeah.
maybe I missed that. But this is like at least in the Western sort of like narrative, at least this is one, right? And if we are to stop this, then uh, I, the conversations will stop, right? Yeah, so
Yeah.
I don't think it's counterproductive for
Yeah.
sure.
Exactly. And I trust Tibetans to
Younger generation folks.
yeah, especially the younger generation. Yeah.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I mean, the evidence is you and Bhuchung Kata for being open, right, to
Yeah.
having
Hmm.
a conversation. I think
Hmm.
this is a good start, right? So yeah, so
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Tsering. This has been wonderful speaking with you, and it just to meet with you again, even though virtually.
Yeah.
The second time I met you was in actually Gumru, the Dora Cafe.
Oh
We were
yeah, yeah,
launching,
yeah. After the reading, right? Yeah,
yeah, we were launching the anthology by
that's cute. Yeah,
Bhuchung Sodam.
yeah,
So yeah, that was interesting. Also, like the whole like, there was honking happening, there was
yeah,
dogs barking, so it was really fun. So it's always nice to have a conversation and chat with you.
yeah. Wonderful to see you again too, and congratulations. That's you've
Yeah,
done really so much as a
yeah.
journalist. Looking
Thank
forward,
you.
looking forward to all the wonderful things all the stories you're gonna write. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so. Like, yeah, definitely. I'll try my best to um yeah, maybe, yeah, walk in your footsteps.
No, 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 not my business.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely I'm trying to tell stories that are important, and hopefully those will be out soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Singa,
Also,
and then I will let you
Kunga,
go now,
thank
and
you.
you have a wonderful day ahead.
You too. All the
Stay
best
warm.
for the rest of the semester and for, your thesis and
Yeah,
let me know if there's anything I can do. Yeah.
yeah, thanks so much, Singa. Okay, take care, bye.
Bye, Puchung. Thank you, Puchung.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Bye.
bye.